Hello everyone, and welcome to History, the show that dives deep into the untold stories of our past. General Võ Nguyên Giáp once made a remarkable prediction. If 1 to 2% of B-52 bombers are shot down, America can still endure it. If 6 to 7% go down, the White House will start to shake. But if the loss rate reaches 10% or more, the United States will have to surrender. And everything happened exactly as the general foresaw. By the end of the campaign, Vietnam's air defense forces had shot down 34 B-52 bombers out of the 193 deployed by the U.S., a loss rate of 17.6%. This shocking number sent tremors throughout America, forcing Washington to halt the bombings and return to the negotiating table, leading to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973. That was an achievement few nations in history could ever dream of, especially a small, war-torn country like Vietnam. But behind that victory were years of relentless work by Vietnamese intelligence officers, who spent nearly a decade studying how the B-52 operated, and even learning the secret communication codes of its pilots. After 1968, when the destructive power of the B-52 became clear, Vietnamese forces immediately launched intelligence missions to gather every bit of information about it. The problem? At that time, most of our soldiers only spoke French. To understand American toys, they now had to learn English. So the Army carefully selected its most talented soldiers, those with strong academic foundations and exceptional language ability, to study English intensively. Because learning conversational English was one thing, but learning technical aviation English, decoding pilot slang, and interpreting encrypted radio chatter was something entirely different. To truly understand what the American pilots were saying, fluency alone wasn't enough. They spoke in codes, sometimes using slang, sometimes numbers, sometimes secret call signs, much like Vietnamese radio operators with their tick-tick-tick Morse transmissions that only insiders could decipher. Even a top linguistics or aviation expert wouldn't have been able to make sense of it. That's why Vietnamese officers had to interrogate captured American pilots at the infamous Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi. Now, these pilots weren't ordinary soldiers. They were highly educated, most held bachelor's degrees from prestigious universities. And some even had master's degrees. They were trained with the best resources the U.S. military could offer. It was often said, if you weighed an American pilot and converted that weight into gold, you'd know just how expensive their training was. For Vietnam's intelligence community, these men were a gold mine of information. The problem was, none of the captured pilots had ever flown a B-52. Most had flown F-4 Phantoms or F-105 Thunderchiefs. In the U.S. Air Force, B-52 pilots were on an entirely different level. But Colonel Phan Mac Lam understood something important: all aircraft, no matter how advanced, shared similar operational principles. So even though those captured pilots weren't B-52 veterans, their knowledge was still incredibly valuable. It's like asking a surgeon about an eye problem, not his specialty. But still better than asking someone with no medical background at all. However, getting them to talk was another challenge. They were proud, disciplined, and had been trained in anti-interrogation tactics. They used secret signals to communicate, tapping bowls, coughing, clinking chopsticks, all of it coded. So direct questioning was useless. Even befriending them rarely worked. So how did the Vietnamese finally get them to open up? Through humanity. Captured pilots were treated with remarkable care. While Vietnamese officers received only 0.68 dong per day for meals, American pilots were given 1.6 dong, and sometimes up to 3.2 dong in special cases. They had access to sports, books, sunbathing, radio, and even music performances. Wounded pilots rescued after ejecting were sent to the best hospitals, Military Hospital 108 and Hospital 103, where they received top-notch care. There was even a female medical officer among the prisoners. The camp staff went out of their way to find feminine supplies for her, items that were extremely rare at the time. They had to scour markets quietly and, when asked, pretend they were buying gifts for their wives. On holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day, the camp even invited a Chinese Vietnamese pastor to hold religious services for those who were Christian. The prisoners' physical and emotional needs were met. They were allowed to write and receive letters from their families, messages that reminded them of life, love, and hope. They wrote to their wives saying they were still alive, and to their children saying, "You still have a father." That compassion changed everything. Gradually, the American pilots began to trust their captors, to speak more openly, and even to cooperate. They feared death, especially from their own B-52 bombers' air raids, and that fear loosened their tongues. Thanks to this humane treatment, Vietnamese intelligence discovered that the prisoners at Võ Lo were the elite of the elite, some with over 6,000 flight hours, some commanding squadrons. Colonel Phan Mac Lam eventually compiled thousands of pages of notes about the B-52's specifications, strengths and weaknesses, flight formations, aerial refueling zones, command centers, and retreat routes, all meticulously documented. By combining prisoner intel with electronic reconnaissance data, the mystery of the B-52 was finally solved. But here's a question. If Vietnamese intelligence was eavesdropping on U.S. pilots, didn't America know? Yes, they did. But the U.S. simply refused to believe that Vietnamese agents were capable of understanding what they heard. In their eyes, Vietnam was a land of peasants who hadn't finished high school. How could such people possibly decipher the secret language of American pilots? They underestimated this, until their own pilots proved them wrong. In fact, those pilots were considered national treasures, sons of powerful families. Political leverage in human form. When one was captured or killed, it made headlines across the U.S. That made them extremely valuable to Vietnam, not only militarily but diplomatically. Võ Lo prison was surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and missiles, in case the U.S. tried a rescue mission, a very real threat. In fact, in 1970, America did launch a daring operation to rescue prisoners at Son Tay prison, an event so dramatic it could have come straight out of a Hollywood movie. And that's where we'll end today's episode of History. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's get this channel to 1 million subscribers soon.